Can you move on? Next slide. Now, in the pre-colonial period, a major source of violence in the history of this country was the trans-Saharan trade, and then the transatlantic slave trade. For the first time, African societies were confronted with the dilemma of either waging war to get slaves or waging war to protect their communities from being attacked by slave raiders. That does not mean that this was a period that we began to experience violence. Violence did not start essentially from this period. But we are looking at the pre-colonial period because we are beginning from there because during the trans-Saharan and the transatlantic slave trade, the violence we are talking about became like a permanent feature of society. You needed to make wars with other communities in order to protect yourselves. That is, if you are not waging war with other communities to get slaves. This itself was a major impetus to violence. So kingdoms and empires waged several wars against each other for slaves, which were captured and exported abroad for cheap manufactured wares. The process of capturing slaves was quite violent, as slaves were generally resistant. To capture somebody, you needed to force the person. That element of force is itself very violent. Nobody willingly gave him or herself as a slave, as far as our history was concerned. So pre-colonial violence were products of the struggle for economic resources, such as land, rivers, and forest reserves. Such conflicts arose from population movement across the earth. The point we are emphasizing here is that in addition to the slave trade, there were certain wars that were waged because of the contestation for land and other resources. In fact, that predated even the slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, where communities would disagree over river, over boundaries, over land resources, and so on and so forth. There were also wars, conflicts that arose out of migrations of people from one point to another. One good example is the migration of the Tiv from the Cameroonian mountains into the Benue Valley. History has it that the migration of this group into the Benue Valley was very phenomenal and created a lot of intergroup conflicts, which were resolved through violent means. That does not mean that we are saying in the pre-colonial times it was only the thieves that were waging wars against their community. I'm citing this as an example of pre-colonial migrations that created conflictual situations which could be interpreted as violence. Next slide, please. Next. In addition to migrations, conflict resulting in violence during this period were also largely part of, I mentioned that, territorial expansion and resistance, political disputes, power tussle by competing groups. There are examples in the history of Nigeria that shows that. If you are familiar with the Yoruba kingdom, in the 19th century, the whole of the Yoruba kingdom, the Yoruba land, that is Yoruba land entirely, was caught up in some political turmoil, which led to the killing of several Alaafins. As a matter of fact, after an attempted palace coup by Bashirun Gaha against an Alaafin, Yoruba land disintegrated, and there was a lot of, virtually every community was a garrison that was waging war on the next community. Apart from Yoruba land, we also heard of the Kwararafa Confederacy located in the Middle Belt, which also suffered that, especially with the emergence of the Tukun, who attempted to also take over power. Now, that led to the collapse of the Confederacy and sparked off migration, massive migration into different parts of north-central Nigeria, otherwise called the Middle Belt. The disintegration of these powerful kingdoms is recorded to have sparked off migrations, and each community was running away or seeking safety by displacing other communities. That process of displacement is recorded to also have been very violent. Other pre-colonial violence were products of minor skirmishes over unresolved contested claims culminating in major intergroup conflicts. There are examples of them. One example I did not give you before the 19th century is the whole of Hausa land, where each Hausa state was waging war against another Hausa state. That war ended when the Sokoto Jihad, was successfully carried out by Uthman Dan Fodio and his forces. But before the 19th century, before 1803 to 1806, 1809, the whole of Hausa land, one community, one Hausa state, Daura was waging war against Katsina, Katsina against Gobir, Gobir against, that history is there. And it went on up until the 19th century. It is often argued that the jihad brought peace into Hausa land, because at the end of the jihad, a Sokoto theocracy was created, and that Sokoto theocracy was what enveloped the entire Hausa land, and then with the emirs recognizing one leader, everybody just shielded his or her swords, and there was some form of peace. Point to note in the pre-colonial phase, it must be noted that the focus on violence here does not imply that wars were the only form of intergroup relations that prevailed between groups during the period under review. The point I'm making here is that there is a tendency for you to believe that, or to imagine that before this period, during the pre-colonial time, or even during the pre-colonial time, what was happening in the whole of the Nigerian area was that communities were fighting. That's not the point I'm making. There were also communities that lived peacefully. But we have teased out these examples to show you that as far as the history of warfare was concerned, we have a number of them in the pre-colonial times. So, move on. Then came the colonial period. The colonial period is an interesting phase because at this point, the entire Nigerian area, made up of several ethnic nationalities, was brought under the power of an alien force. Because colonialism is associated with European imperialism. The colonization experience in Nigeria was very, very brutal. It was a very brutal process. It was so brutal that the British government had to look for a military man that was almost like near man. Lugard, they said he had some psychological issue. And so they brought him to pacify Nigerian ethnic nationalities and all that. And if you look at Lugard's trajectory as, the Governor General, or what even aided him that position, was the way and manner that he carried out the process of unleashing brutality on the various Nigerian ethnic nationalities. Bear that at the back of your mind. The colonial phase also involved the sanguinary subjugation of the people and the brutal sequestration of their land and other resources. The reason why colonialism came into Nigeria and other African countries should be noted, because that explains the quantum of violence that was unleashed on the people. Colonialism came into Nigeria because of the crisis Europe was facing by the 19th century, arising from the application of science and technology in the production processes of Europe, what we call industrial revolution. The contradiction in the industrial revolution in Europe necessarily created three very, very important problems that needed to be resolved. Europe was industrializing very fast. Europe needed raw material sources to feed its expanding industries. Europe needed markets to sell finished products of the industrial process. Europe also needed profitable fields of investment to expand its profit base. This was happening because not just Britain, other European countries were also industrializing. So market for industrial produce, cheap industrial produce, had shrunk considerably. In fact, they were saturated, if you like. They had saturated, and because of that, you needed to go somewhere else where you could get markets to sell your finished product. Now, because of this, there was a sense of urgency which was expressed by the way and manner that the peoples of Nigeria or the ethnic nationalities in Nigeria and other African countries were subjugated. This was the reason why the colonization process was actually very, very brutal, because they were running out of time. It is about the survival of one country against the survival of another country. And because technologically we were backward, it was very easy to overrun us. Our ancestors were fighting with bow and arrows and clubs when the Europeans were using gunboats and some other things. They had industrialized, so they had advanced weapons. The military officers here will tell you the technology of war at that time, and the exploits of power was at the advantage, was at the disposal of the Europeans and against our people. These independent ethnic nationalities were therefore forcefully subdued and subjugated to an oppressive alien colonial authority that had little or no regard at all the interests of people. Immediately they were conquered, a colonial economy was established to meet the demands of Europe. This was what led to boundary adjustment, which was done without regard to the colonial patterns of interaction. The process of creating boundaries itself was very, very brutal. There's an example here you note in the post-colonial period, and that's why I'm just telling you, for you to understand post-colonial problems that the nation Nigeria is facing, you must go back to what happened under colonialism, because nothing much has really changed. Move on. The relationship, and this is very important, the relationship between the colonial force and Nigerians was that of subordination and superordination. And what that meant was that power relations was not equal. And because power relations was not equal, the relationship was immersed and saturated in irreconcilable contradictions. The people were interested in running away from the brutality of the colonial government, and then from the brutality of the interests it is pushing in their territory. The colonial government was determined to make sure that they remain and become sources for its own solutions. So this relationship was what defined how, and that was why when people resisted taxation, the colonial government would dispatch the colonial force, go and establish law and order. The definition of law and order did not just arise. It came with force. Law and order simply means make sure you cow everybody into submission. Let's have peace. Even if it's a graveyard peace, that will give us the opportunity to brutally exploit the people and their resources. The colonial authority was intolerant of dissent and relied on naked force, extreme brutality, to negotiate his dominance over the country. The point I'm trying to make is that the process of even establishing an authority was brutal. But if people try to say, look, this thing you are doing to me, I'm a human being, I don't want it, they were made to keep quiet, brutal. That's the point. And so, the colonial authority did not tolerate any excuse from anybody. It just wanted you to accept the reality of your condition. You are a conquered people. And who you think you are, what you could do and could not do was determined by that authority.
Resistance was resisted.
Yes. Colonialism in Nigeria was characterized. These are, forget all those words there. The summary is that it's about power. It was characterized by atavism. Atavism simply means that you are, because of the contradictions that exist, you are either resisting or you are being forced to accept. So you are atavistic. You want to just do something and then move. There is also bellicosity, impunity, political lawlessness, and state rascality. All these define the characterization of the colonial state. You come into a people's territory, you draw boundaries the way you want. You reorganize them and say, you people move this way, the other people move that way. Not taking into cognizance patterns of relations before the colonization experience. If you resisted, they deal with you. Our traditional rulers were shoved aside, except for those who were willing to cooperate with the colonial government. How indirectly came into existence followed that narrative. The colonial government selected people who it felt could do the job more. And that was why, unlike in the traditional times, when the chief was also the priest of the community, in which case you have chief priest or king priest. Under colonialism did not pay any attention to people who are really aged, because in the traditional society then, the aged were noted for wisdom, the aged were also noted for being very close to the spiritual world. But they were not active in the sense that the colonial government wanted them. The colonial government wanted people who could move into community to gather taxes and then identify where there are mineral resources and other things. But these old people who were revered and were considered the knowledge banks of society were shown aside. That's one example. The second example is in northern Nigeria, where this thing succeeded. The marriage between the emirship and the colonial government system of indirect was out of convenience. The colonial government discovered that it had conquered a vast territory in the Nigerian area, and therefore it did not have men on the spot that could carry out the activity. So it decided to say the cheapest means to do this thing is to, get some local willing rulers who will do what you want to do, or you recognize their authority. This was what led to that marriage. It has nothing to do with the colonial government was in love or got enthralled by, the political structure it meant in northern Nigeria. It has nothing to do with that. After all, even some emirs were deposed who did not cooperate. Familiar with the attacking rebellion. Under colonialism, the people resisted. The colonial government brought maximum force. As a matter of fact, Atahiru village was reduced to rubble. And that community has not survived up to today. If you go to that community today, you will see that the relic of the brutality still exists in that place. Colonialism was kind of, yes. What to note here is that by its very nature and character, colonialism consolidated the use and abuse of violence in the history of Nigeria. From this period, as you will see, when you move to the post-colonial period, you begin to see that even leaders who took over from the departing colonial masters did not change significantly from this template of relating with the citizens of the country. Next slide. Next slide. let's look at the post-colonial phase. By 1960, Nigeria transited, we said we struggled for independence. As my teacher used to tell us those days, it was a convenient negotiation into neo-colonialism. There was no independence. You don't do independence with you don't struggle for independence with someone who is your overlord, and you sit on the table like this, the way we are seated. They serve you tea, and then you drink like the person who wants to give you independence. Frantz Fanon has this popular quotation. He said, and I quote, "Freedom is not a commodity given to the enslaved or punished man. It's a shining trophy of struggle and sacrifice." So if you look at that quotation, you will discover that even though our nationalists will tell you they struggle for their independence, I begin to wonder whether it was really strong. And if it is, or if it was, did we value that independence? What happened in the first, second, third, we announced of the fourth republic? So, the evidence shows that in 1960, Nigeria transited from a colony into a neo-colony, with little or no changes in the character of the state or its operators. The implantation of ethnicity, religion, and regionalism in the nation body policy from 1945 became the basis of identity politics, which is the greatest source of conflict and violence in this country. The deployment of ethnicity and religion as weapons of negotiation between the ruling elite generated and amplified violence in post-colonial Nigeria. A number of these violent conflicts can be identified. Next slide. So, if you look at the history of Nigeria from 1960, you then on 1963, we had a census crisis which resulted into very serious violence in the history of this country. In 1965, there was a Western regional crisis involving Action Group and MDC. By 1966, we had the violent, we had the violent coup, very bloody coup of 1966. This was accompanied by riots. These are all episodes of violence. And between 1966 and 1967, our ruling class would not agree over how to resolve their differences. By 1967 to 1970, Nigeria fought a 30-year civil war, which was also very good. Depending on who is quoting, they say between 1 million and 2 million Nigerian, 1 million, right? 2 million Nigerians perished. It is estimated that 2 million lives were lost as a result of the Nigerian Civil War. By violence we experienced was the Medicine riots, in which cumulatively over 800 lives were lost and properties worth billions and billions of naira perished. Shortly after that, in the 90s, we slided into what became the Niger Delta militants. A struggle that arose out of environmental injustice. You are familiar with this. For a period of almost 10-15 years, the country battled with this. And by the end of, by the beginning of the Goodluck Jonathan's administration, conservatively, they say about 15,000 lives were lost. I say conservative because I know several died. Next slide. Next slide, next slide. Then you slide into the late 90s, 2000. Another form of violence began to become very evident. The farmer headers conflict, and still smoking till date. As of 2018, not less than 5,000 people were killed and properties worth $5 million destroyed. In Benue State alone, over 7,000 rural dwellers were displaced. And between 1999 to date, over 70% of those displaced are in camps, uprooted from their community. So you are looking at the period of the democracy. They are still killing people in Benue State. In 2019, why this was happening simultaneously, thank God the chairman, Professor Ochoche, is somebody who was very active during this period, chasing peace for the country. We had the Boko Haram in the northeast, and we are still battling it. Nigerian civil war. It has challenged the legitimacy of the post-colonial state in ways that nothing has challenged it before. And by 2011, it has caused the death of over 7,000 people and displaced 2.5 million in the northeast alone. When you move further, aside this violence conflict post-colonial Nigeria has experienced, there are other forms of violence, including those arising from group conflicts over minor issues. The Benue Valley. Everything about chieftaincy will cause problem in the Benue Valley. As simple as creating chiefdoms or even creating institutions, it will result into violence. There are all forms of there are also issues around envy, petty envy, hatred, deep-set animosity, and the urge for revenge. This is where the thing about peace is very, very important. Where you preach peace, you forget about generational hatred, generational animosity, and then you can begin to relate as people from one country. Next slide, please. How has violence impacted on this country? A violent order has implications for peace and harmonious existence, whether this is in the family, community, or the larger society. Peace is important, especially for conglomerate societies like ours. By conglomerate here, that Nigeria is a plural society with people from different places, cultures, and traditions. This implies that the prevalence of conflicts and violence obstructs development at all levels. In this regard, violent progress, because of its capacity to generate chaos and disorders. The destruction that traces violence generates bitterness, hatred, and animosity, all of which negatively impacts peaceful, personal, and intergroup relations. Protracted violence has led to massive population movements, attacking of communities, and displacement. We are examples of this across all the geopolitical zones. Next slide. They say I have 5 minutes. I want to wrap up. Violence or prolonged threat of fear terrorizes and generates fear. And that type of atmosphere is difficult to talk about development. There are those who suffer post-traumatic stress disorder and related psychosis as a result of violence. Arising from the capacity of violence to generate confusion and chaos, it kills initiative. In a violent society, you can't plan. You can't engage in meaningful personal growth endeavors. You can't invest. People first survive. Your primary concern is that you should survive before you can plan, before you can do anything. Violence generates a siege mentality that impacts negatively on development. Generally, violence makes a society, makes a social space unsafe, and therefore unattractive for meaningful, productive activities. The prevalence of violence in post-colonial Nigeria has driven investors. Every year, government keep talking about investors to come. Nobody who wants to come and invest in an environment that is very violent, in an environment that is unpredictable, in an environment that you can't guarantee peace. Next, protracted violence in post-colonial Nigeria has negatively affected the image of the country. There are some statistics drawn from 1999. They say the country is ranked the 10th most terrorized country in the world by the Institute for Peace, Institute for Economic Peace. In 1999, same year, in September, Forbes magazine rated Nigeria as the 10th worst place to live in the world. All these are statistics. Human Angle in 1999 declared that due to the worsening ripples of violent conflict across the country, many generations of Nigerians are more familiar with conflict than they are with peace. I made that point at the beginning. 90% of our conversations as Nigerians revolves around violence, revolves around conflict. We don't do peace talk or peace talking. And until we get to that point where even 60% of our conversation revolves around peace, development, you can't track development, you can't initiate development. In 2020, the Global Peace Index ranked Nigeria 147 out of 167 countries. The US Department designated Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization and a specially designated global terrorist at this stage. Boko Haram in Nigeria. The point there is that Boko Haram has become, one of the major sources of violence in this country. Next. 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 So all these statistics about your country, whether they are true or not, says a lot about the current reality that we confront. The implication is that we must try to move away from violence. There are some people who believe that violence is part of development. You need to do violence in order to move forward. But the kind of violence we are talking about is one that obstructs even development. We must try to do more of peace than violence, because at the end of the day, you need peace in order to exist, both as an individual, a community, a society, and a nation. I want to conclude by thanking the organization for inviting me to give this talk and to ask the participants to preach more of peace than violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. This has been a great delivery, taking us through many dimensions of violence, the history of it, different phases and manifestations, period, pre-colonial to the present. Not make any attempt to summarize the lecture would be really insulting our intelligence. So we will go straight into the interactive session. Invite questions, comments, participants. As we do that, I want you to see if we can also try to drill deeper, except for that. So much, I mean, the topic definitely is violence. The discussion has focused on violence. Should we expand it maybe beyond violence to conflict? The challenges and the dynamics of security that we face, are there elements of it that may not be violent but still? Or I mean, when I think about physical violence, and yet quite frightening. I know you also address the different components of violence. And the most extreme form of violence is war. And there are some school of thought that will tell you that in fact, both conflict and even the extreme form of violence, war, as destructive as they are, may also have been constructive. The economies that have developed and evolved around the war machinery, just like we needed to, but for the structure, the architecture around violence, the gentleman, the lady, their uniform probably not be here. Probably not be here. But question two is, how do we manage, or how can these elements be structured, or are they abused, to our destruction and so on? So maybe we need to look at these different dimensions elections as well as the conversation to also add that, especially in our post-independent phase in Nigeria, the place of political violence, especially related to elections, especially related to elections. If you look at this country, especially since 1999, there is a direct correlation between the emergence of bandit groups, of terror groups, and the electoral cycle. There's a direct correlation. National elections tend to throw up new groups or empower small, non-existent groups. So as we look at the security dynamics, violence and the security dynamics, the role of political violence and especially elections will be one that we want to look at. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor.
He was not here when the introductions were made, so maybe if you want to intervene, you want to just introduce yourself by name and organization and country.
Okay.
Sit down, sir.
All right. My name is Ezekiel Samaila, and I'm based in Germany as a cross-cultural consultant. I have maybe one or two quick questions in relation to some of the things you mentioned that caught my attention. You mentioned that if the citizen can feed themselves, the country is not safe. Recently, I was asked, because I was a former street kid that got rescued when I was like 8, 9 years old. Long story, I got trained and maybe one of the low-key ones. When we look at the northern part of Nigeria, I think it's a region, safe to say, that is ravaged by that extreme level of street kids, whether it's Almajiri or homeless and all of that, which means when I was on the street, if not that I got rescued, I could have potentially done anything for food. Because that was just what I wanted was just food. So if anybody would have come with weapons or anything like, this is food, do this, I would have been an easy target. So since we know potentially this is one possible means to recruit people into terrorism, considering the hunger, the suffering in the nation, which in Nigeria at the moment probably it's not many people that can have a proper 3-meal, good one, in a day. And our university, somebody signed up for 4 or 5 years, half of the time they are on the strike. And the youth are not doing anything, they are at home, except those who are privileged to go to private universities, then that's not an issue. So if you look at all these factors contributing to whether unemployment or you have youth at home doing nothing, full of energy and passion, wouldn't that, it's not an excuse, but wouldn't that be a contributing factor to why people indulge in terrorism? Because I live in Germany, for example, when I look at the society, I feel like people are too busy to even do any crime. Because you wake up in the morning, the society has already structured you, you go to work, you work until 4, 5, or 6 p.m., you return home. For those that are married, you spend time with your wife for dinner and all of that. So the cycle continues. So the free time you have, you just want to rest. But we're in a society or in a country where people are unemployed, can't afford to go to school. So there's a luxury of time for people to cook up crime or in the survival mode. So what do you see as an alternative that can help either with the youth or the Almajiri or the street kids and all of that we know that whether the Boko Haram or any form of terrorist group find them as an easy target to recruit, because somebody who has been to school, even if it is a...
Sorry, can I something the intervention?
Thank you, sir. Even if it is just a high school graduate, they at least have a form of defense to question anybody who tried to recruit them in comparison to somebody who have never been to a classroom.
Thank you very much. How do you want us to do it from? Want to take the one? Okay. Please, I encourage us to be content with our information. Just take it. Any other? Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. Mine is more of observation and perhaps can also react. So, in the course of the it's Akiwumi, Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, thank you for the history of violence that you gave in Nigeria. But I was thinking that probably those different violence from the pre to colonial to probably can actually be categorized to ideological and non-ideological based violence. So, because if the categorization, what it will do is to also inform the kind of intervention that can be taken to address some of the violence and situating it within the context of the forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation. And I give an example. So, because of the fact that the Operation Safe Corridor is successful, I mean, at the moment, as a non-kinetic tool to address terrorism or in Gombe, is moving to Zamfara to address for the Northwest. So, and there are people that already say that, are we also going to admit the bandits? Is it banditry that we are dealing with terrorism? Are we dealing with bandits or we are dealing with terrorists? So if that is properly categorized, is it non-violent, is it ideological driven, or just violent? So the second aspect of my intervention is just an observation that some of the statistics that were given, probably it will have been, number one, the source of those statistics, and because that's one of the issues that will be having conflicting figures, even though I know we may not have a great figure in terms of statistics. And again, the recency of those statistics. So I realized that in the presentation, the recent statistics that we have is probably 2020, and there were some statistics that were like 2011, and a lot of things have changed. Thank you, Prof.
I'll take one more. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Prof. My name is Brian Crystal. Yes, actually,
Sorry, can you say something?
I said my name is Brian Crystal, PhD. I'm a research manager at PhD. My question was, after your lecture and your presentation, I have some questions, 2 or 3 questions to ask. The first one is this: what is the cumulative historical implication of violence in the political, socio-economic status of Nigeria? Then, what is the knowledge derived from the historical perspective? And thirdly, what do you think should be the remedial solution based for the proper integration, reconciliation, and justice served for proper forgiveness to ascertain its purpose?
Let me get that second question.
The second question says, that's what is the knowledge derived from the historical perspective of the violence in Nigeria?
Let me start from the last question, the last set of questions. What is the essence of understanding the history of violence in this country? From what I've presented, it's very, very clear that violence has done collateral damage to this country. And you also agree with me that where violence is the major preoccupation of society, there is the tendency that development can never occur. In fact, scholars have argued that Nigeria is not making progress. It's not that we don't have policies. There are policies. There are people who formulate these policies, but Nigeria is not making headway or progress, if you like, because of the prevalence of not just violence or conflict. We spend more time on conflict than we do on things that should move society forward. I've made that point repeatedly. And it's at that point that I anchor on the fact that we should begin to do more of peace talking than violent talking. And when we talk in terms of peace talking, that's where the element of forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation will come in. Because you cannot do peace if you don't forgive. If you can't do peace, you can't do peace if you don't forgive someone who has hurt you. And then you can't do peace if you don't have justice. And when I mean justice here is those that are found wanting, society should see that justice has been done. You know, all these play into the central question of giving everybody a place to exist as a citizen. Now, cumulative effect of whatever the history of violence in this country. In my summary, I made the point that the nation has had its own set of violence over time, and you can trace it back into history. History has documented these aspects of violence that have occurred, and this violence have impacted society negatively. The point Prof made that there are certain violence that can be constructive is also very, very important, because there are instances where you do violence in order to reconstruct society. I always say, I majored in intergroup relations from the University of Jos, and part of what we teach is that the existence of peaceful relationship does not entirely mean that there is no conflict. There can be, as a matter of fact, both conflict or conflictual relationship and peaceful relationship are different sides of the same coin. But there are certain instances where negotiating peace will get to a point where it is not possible until some form of violence has been done. At the end of that violence, a new peace will emerge. Because if you take, I'll give a very good example that is maybe very mundane. You are always bullying me in school. So one day I decided that, look, this bullying must end today. It's either you kill me or I kill you. We fight. And by that decision I took, that you either kill me or I kill you, I end up beating you. You know, you stop believing. A new peace has emerged. So we emphasize this violence not so much because we don't think that there can be peace. Violence cannot create a condition for peace. Violence does create a condition for peace. If you've been following what is happening globally in Ukraine, in the Middle East, it's all about differing perspectives, which the parties concerned cannot resolve. But they have gone into war. At the end of that war, I know that a new peace will emerge. So there's a whole lot of things that you can bring to the table on this. And it has serious implications on the central theme of this workshop, which is forgiveness, justice, reconciliation. Because you can't have all that if the central focus of establishing peace is not there. How do you do that? We are saying that we talk more of conflict and violence in this country than we do more of peace and peaceful negotiation as one. Akiwumi, you talked about categorization. I agree with you. Categorization is important. But you see, when I was given this, I was told to talk about just general history of violence. The matrix about categorization is a possibility because it is at the level of that categorization that you will know what type of intervention can you deploy. But if you look very closely at the presentation, you will discover that, especially when we are identifying 9 types of violence, and where we anchor and say that security is much more than the presence of hardware. You know, that definition of security was operational during the Cold War, where a state's power is measured by the quantum of hardware it has in its arsenal. We have gone beyond that. You can have all those. If your citizens are hungry, you don't have security. And this resonates with what my friend there, Ezekiel, was trying to raise. There was a video that was circulated, and I think a number of Nigerians watched that video, like a TikTok or something. Somewhere in Kano, somebody was doing the narration, and they were just videoing a vast expanse of parts of Kano on the streets. Children from age 1 to about 6, they were just on the streets. If you watch that video very closely, you will understand the connection between economic disempowerment and insecurity in this country. Even in the Boko Haram thing, part of the reasons analysts always give is because these people don't have any means of existence. They will tell you that. But the real cause of that, like Prof pointed out, is about politics, identity contestation. Our elite created that. And they create it for their own reason. Majority of those who became Boko Haram were thugs for politicians. Let's be. How it started, they were thugs. They were given weapons to fight political opponents. And at the end of the announcement of electoral results and all that, you lock up government house and say, elections have been won, it's now time for government. I fight to steal ballot boxes for you. You are now in government, you lock me out and say I should come and surrender weapons. What will I use to feed my family? That connection, Prof, that connection is what we must understand. Because, like you rightly pointed out, the little modicum of peace we have is maybe 2 years in an election cycle, when government settles down and when they start preparations for election. By the middle of this year, in fact, they've started preparation, but it will heat up as we move towards the end of the year. From that period, you would have identified who is a possible opponent. And since you know that his credentials, you know, is, to use a local phrase, is thicker than your own credentials, you must find a way of stopping him. Political violence will be key. We need to have a situation where, good, I'll wrap up now. We need to have a situation where we begin to look at political power not as a zero-sum game. Until we get to that point where the winner doesn't take all. As a matter of fact, political power should be an instrument for development. We are going to continue to do around this. This is a cause of what we keep having. They formed government. They said, no, he was not there when we were fighting. It is our turn to chop. He should wait for his turn. That government, that kind of politics where you say somebody should wait for his turn, when everybody knew how you got to power, If the game were in the daylight and done according to the rules, there are some persons that can never find themselves, even as local government councillors. They will never get it. But here we are, criminals taking over government and then using state power to afflict pain through a process of disempowerment, political rascality and all that. All this is what is generating the insecurity that we are talking about. And until we are able to track this and nip it in the bud, the development that you claim you have will be development that somebody will be praising himself. Politicians pay salaries, they say it's development. Somebody's right. You put a 2-kilometer road, you bring the whole press to come and praise you that this is what you have done. This is part of development. You are put there to deliver that. We don't know what is development again, but because of the way development and its consequences have been misinterpreted by our politicians. I had a governor who ran a state for 8 years. He was telling people that his only achievement is that he made sure Fulanis never come into the state. But that was a lie. Fulanis did come into the state. If he paid salary, he would go and be beating drums in the marketplace that he has paid them 2 months. You are only for over 2 years, 3 years. You pay only 2 months to say you have paid salary. That is development. You can't develop it. Thank you very much.
Prof,
Thank you so much.
I have a question, Prof. Sorry. Thank you, Prof.
You promise you can
Yeah, very brief.
do it in 30 seconds, and I also need to get from to also promise that you can answer in 1 minute.
1 minute, yes. No.
So 30 seconds.
Prof, thank you very much for the lecture. When you were talking about agitation for independence in Nigeria,
Yes.
you spoke as if you were suggesting that we got independent in the plateau of gold and exactly how to run values. I was thinking that we have a lesson to learn from Nigerian nationalists. Talking about non-violence agitation. They didn't come through violence. I thought we have a lesson to learn from them as we are talking about agitation.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, I come from, if you listen to somebody talking, you will know his ideological disposition about several things. And background. It's something I have written on several, the decolonization process. Our decolonization process was when the negotiation into neocolonialism occurred. Our leaders who fought for that independence were not prepared to sever the relationship that the country was going to continue to have after the departing colonial overlord left. They were not. They were more interested in the shoes that the colonial government was leaving behind. They were not prepared for the responsibility of that, of the shoes. So to a very large extent, patriotism, their patriotism was called to question. And that was why from 1946, in the Macpherson's whatever, if you saw what was happening, everybody went to his own region and became a king god. At that point, the nation was not what was in question. I mean, was not the concern of anybody. You were not talking about integrating the various regions. You were more for less fragment. And now we move the motion for independence of Nigeria. The other regions said they were not ready. And we have continued in that trajectory. Look at the whole of northern Nigeria today. When we were talking about education even from the colonial period, as minimal as education was during the colonial period, the colonial authority says, don't go there, don't carry Christianity, don't carry education to that place. By the First Republic, you could count the number of graduates in northern Nigeria. And when I mean northern Nigeria, I'm not including the middle belt. Because if you include the middle belt, the figure will go up. Remove the middle belt and concentrate on the final. You'll be amazed. From that period, any policy, any national policy they look at it from that point. How many of our sons would this cover? How many of these would this cover? And you see, we keep going back and forth. You must own a nation in order to prosecute a development plan. Once you don't have a nation, anything you are doing is just at the regional level. And this is the tragedy of this country. And that's why we keep saying, our independence, perhaps if we had gone the Mau way in Kenya, we would have valued our independence more.
Okay, thank you so much. But I think you raised an interesting thing. I know this whole narrative of independence on the platter of gold is part of our challenge. But you raised an interesting dimension. I think it was also even Machiavelli that says that it is the bad general that has to go to war to win the conflict. And a good general, by strategy and by manipulation, will win the. If you have to go and shoot a gun before you defeat the enemy, it shows your weakness that you can win without having to shoot. So maybe it's really about that. When they are politicians who are so skillful, they were so skillful, they were so good, they negotiated independence without having to do the Mao and Maji revolution thing. But that's an interesting issue we may need to look at. But thank you so much, Prof. You know, so much of the challenge we have. I have been waiting to hear the general following, with all due respect, the humiliation our military suffered in the Northeast. To say, never again will the Nigerian military suffer this. I've been waiting to hear the politician who, from what we suffered, losing ground to some riffraffs, hosting their flags there to say, never again will Nigeria go through this. Because very few people are carrying the pain of Nigeria.
It's traumatic. When are you making from the pain?
Exactly. I was privileged when I was in the Indian High Commissioner coming to deliver a lecture on the Indian military industrial complex. And he said after India was defeated in the 1962 the war with China in 1962, India said never again will India lose the war. Never again. And they went to work. I've been to the Mazagon dockyard to see the type of ship being constructed. I've been to naval bases where the lineup of submarines, all Indian-made submarines. The frigates, Indian constructed frigates. India said never again. They lose the war. So, how many of us feel the pain of Nigeria? And like the captain said, brother, we bleed the country and we contribute to the bleeding. Thank you so much. May I now invite Mrs. Chioma Umebo to deliver the vote of thanks and make a token presentation to our guest lecturer. I think since you are close to each other there, you can do it there while the camera is also close there. So,
on behalf of the participants, we thank you, Prof, for this wonderful lecture. It was quite educative and instructive, and I really learned a lot from the history of violence, honestly. We thank you, sir. So thank you for talking and the wonderful work that you've done.
Thank you so much. Our next lecturer is here. I know from the program we are supposed to be going for lunch, but we are really running behind schedule. And to also bear in mind that there are some of us who have not even had the tea break that we had. So maybe for those of us who had the privilege of tea break and so on, is it possible for us to take the next lecture and have the lunch later? It's our decision. What do we say?
I think the lecture.
We can take the lecture? Okay, so are we agreed we'll take the lecture now? Okay, we'll just take 2 minutes leg stretch and then reconvene for the next lecture.
Somebody's going to talk. Okay.
Okay, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. For the completion of this program, we have our next lecturer with us. And I've been critical subject, very important for the talk. And it is trauma awareness, resilience, and healing. Very, very critical for issues of reconciliation, issues of forgiveness. And the presenter is Professor Andrew Zamani from the Department of Psychology, National State University. A very distinguished scholar, life experience in these issues. It's a privilege to have him to deliver his presentation on this subject. So, good to see you again. Yeah, 50 of these openings.
Good evening, Chairman, distinguished participants. It's quite a privilege to have Prof to chair my session. Prof was one of my teachers at UVJ many years ago. Also, that we are meeting here an institute that we founded, more or less. So, Prof, it's a great pleasure. Welcome, sir, again. Trauma awareness, resilience, and healing. It's the topic we're treating this evening. I don't know how much attention you have given trauma in the past 1 year. Trauma is one issue that is hardly discussed, hardly treated, and sometimes when it is discussed, it is not properly understood, and so the messages that are exchanged are not correct, and therefore the things that should be done about trauma are not properly done. We take the wrong steps and we create new traumas. So I am really very happy that we're discussing trauma awareness today. There are a few background issues that I want us to actually look at. And the first has to do with this even marriage issue. Can I go closer? Let me go closer. No. I need it. The first has to do with the fact that while the world gets more integrated through immigration, technology, we are under the illusion that we are one. Inequality and social gaps continue to exist and even widen. Poverty and hunger have now become potent tools for our leaders to control people. As a matter of fact, personal autonomy is jettисoned for mediocrity, psychopathy, and so on. Now, I want you to note that whereas excellence is what everybody desires, it appears that people who get into positions of leadership prefer to promote, to demean excellence and to promote mediocrity. And it is usually very easy to do, when you get psychopaths around you, or when you flaunt nepotism, or when you engage ethnic or religious sentiments, just to have your way. These things cause a lot of emotional and social injuries. Our new status of leaders in different countries have emerged in virtually all sectors of life, whose acumen and capacities impose burden of perpetual economic crisis, poverty, insecurity in all domains. As a matter of fact, one major consequence of all of this is what I call menticide. And by definition, I say menticide is intellectual ineptitude and failure syndrome that promotes the slave mentality. Next. All right. Civilization is impacting more negatively on humanity to the extent that vices are more applauded now than virtues. Destructive behavior is more preferred. Can you go back, please? Is more preferred than value for life. Thank you. Religion is fast losing its relevance as a tool for spiritual nourishment, for social cordiality, as a framework for justice, a tool for ethical reorientation, moral development. So man is in the need of love, but is engrossed in promoting prejudices. Man's increase in knowledge is now mostly used for destructive purposes. What are the things that we face trauma in various ways? And we all know the term trauma. We know the term trauma. Unfortunately, for many years now, trauma has been a very highly misunderstood concept. So there are very many misconceptions of trauma. One misconception is that it is mainly caused by combat, by wars, and by violence. Secondly, that it is attributable mainly to sudden devastating, stressful life events, such as disasters or social disappointments, loss of friendship, disappointment by friends, and so on. It happens only to people who are weak-hearted or those who do high-risk jobs. This is a misconception. It has little to do with service delivery or caregiving. So trauma happens to only the victim and not the helper. It's a misconception. It is not related to daily life experiences. Again, it's a misconception. Because trauma
is not bred by episodic events alone. It has to do with a series of life experiences, the cumulative effect of the experiences we have had, their nature, and their impact on us. That trauma is hardly detectable in children. And so when a child is agitated, when a child throws some tantrums, when a child is hyperactive, when a child is abused, when a child is docile, most of the times the tendency that we have is to describe him in negative terms, such as give a dog a bad name, to hang it. So we can punish the child, so we can neglect the child, and so on. And yet, trauma may be hidden in these behaviors. People who suffer from trauma have poor coping skills. It is not true that in all cases people who suffer trauma have poor coping skills. So, how have these misconceptions affected trauma care? One, it has made it very difficult for symptoms of trauma to be recognized, even by mental health experts. It has made it very, very difficult. Sometimes we see trauma, but we don't recognize it. So we miss diagnosing trauma. And so you know that the definition you give a problem determines what you do about it. So if you have missed trauma and you are calling trauma depression, then you would be treating trauma. What you will be treating is depression. And to the extent that you have not identified the real problem, you will either be complicating the trauma or giving resistant treatment. Sometimes we misdiagnose. The features of trauma are there, but the mental health practitioner, for reasons best known to him, or for lack of competence, diagnosis something else. Let me go back to depression. Now, if you miss a diagnosis, it means you have not recognized the problem. But sometimes you recognize the problem, but you give it a different name. That is what we mean by misdiagnosis. For us, as individuals, most of the times, we do not recognize that the things we are going through are trauma. That the behaviors we exhibit arise from traumatic experiences. And so, to the extent that we do not recognize that they are trauma-related experiences, we underreport the problem. And so, if you do not report what is happening to you, if you keep it to yourself because you don't understand it or you don't recognize it, then the people who are out there who are ready to help, who are trained to help, would not know how much of the problem exists. So we have problem definition arising from under-reporting and underutilization of care services. And here is a big confession. It is a neglected area of research in mental health. 2 weeks ago, the Nigerian Police Force invited me to make the contribution on how to integrate mental health services in their social welfare scheme. And I was trying to, I went in search of information on national studies in Nigeria on mental health for security agencies. And the data was scanty. The data was, the ones that I got did not even represent a divisional police post, a divisional police unit, which means that we have a lot to do. As for mental health generally, I want you to imagine trauma as an aspect of mental awareness that is first poorly recognized, missed in the diagnostic process, or misdiagnosed, or is underreported. How much of information would we say that it's a neglected area? So it's a virgin area. This is why I'm excited that we are treating this issue today. Just for the sake of discussion, so that we'll be on the same page, some definitions of trauma and elaborations of the definition are given. Trauma, for this purpose, is intense emotional response to severely distressing life events or threats to life and well-being, either to self or to others. And trauma is usually characterized by intrusive memories. And I want you to mark that. You know, I've already even made the point that several times people exclude trauma from daily life experiences. They just think this is an event that happened and somebody was devastated, and so the person was traumatized, and that is it. He needs to be treated. We give little attention to historical events, to adversities that people have experienced in the course of their lives. I'm saying that one of the ways that you recognize trauma is intrusive memories, abnormal changes in thinking and mood, altered physical functioning, and emotional reactions. Psychological trauma has three aspects: the event, the experience, and the effects. The event, the experience, and the effects. The events are triggers. The experiences are the symptoms that are manifested. And of course, the effects are the impacts or consequences of the events. Some names are given to trauma. Shock. I was shocked. He injured me. I mean, not just physically, he injured my heart. Or he devastated me emotionally. Or he put me into confusion. So what's the nature of trauma? All traumas have psychological consequences. All experiences that are described reside in memories. Not every traumatic event is a direct event on the affected individual. Some traumatic experiences are vicarious. Recall that one of the misconceptions that I mentioned was that people who offer help to traumatized people don't experience trauma. No. In fact, somebody somebody can acquire trauma from helping somebody who is traumatized. Trauma may occur from accumulated adverse life events. So trauma is experiential. Sometimes people